Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Support for this episode comes from NordVPN.
Well, this week, Alastair, I want to highlight Nord's browser extension. So this is a super fast, very lightweight version of their VPN app, and you can use it on Google Chrome, on Microsoft Edge, and on Firefox.
And does it work in exactly the same way as the other stuff you've been talking about?
Yep, you can just install it, turn it on, leave it running, and in the background, it will secure all your browser traffic. So even if a website isn't encrypted, you won't be a target for online spying. It will mask your IP from websites, so it keeps your identity hidden. And it also blocks intrusive ads and protects you from dangerous links to malicious websites.
Okay, I know you love your analogies. So this is like a digital watchdog inside your browser.
Exactly. And it's a great way to take advantage of a Nord subscription, which now covers 10 devices rather than 6, so your money goes even further.
So if you want to try NordVPN for yourself, go to nordvpn.com/restispolitics, and our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. That is the best discount available. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and it's a great way to support the podcast. The link is in the podcast episode description box.
Alastair, let me start you on Kenya, a country that both of us know reasonably well. Jos Goa, there's been very little coverage in the UK of what's happening in Kenya currently. Do you think the Gen Z protests have the power to change not just Kenya, but all of Africa?
Well, you're absolutely right. There's been very, very little coverage of it. And you often talk about the role that social media played in the uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring. And I wonder if behind the question is the possibility that social media can play a similar role in Africa, because what's been really interesting about these protests in Kenya, which are about a finance bill, which are about putting people's taxes up, very unpopular tax plans, protests have developed that don't appear to have any kind of political figurehead whatsoever. It's just groups of what are called Gen Z people, a lot of it fueled by TikTok. Now, sometimes we can look at TikTok, and I often look at TikTok and worry about its implications for politics, particularly in the way that the hard right use it in some of the developed democracies. But what's happening here, I think, is that people are really learning that they have real power through protest. And on the social media thing, for example, one of the things they're doing is Ruto, President William Ruto, who obviously is the leader of the country and the one who's behind these tax changes. One of the effective kind of mini campaigns that's going on is this thing #unfollow Ruto. So what they're doing is basically saying, there's the guy, he's got more followers than most people in Kenya. Let's take him off and show that we've got the real power. Now, the protests are becoming quite violent, quite a lot of people being injured, but more and more young people do seem to be taken to the streets. And it's an interesting development.
Well, just to take it back a bit, I mean, the whole thing is really surprising. So William Ruto was in some ways the surprise winner of the 2022 general election, because President Kenyatta, who was the kind of establishment figure and the son of the great founding president of Kenya, got behind his traditional rival Raila Odinga.
Yeah.
And it felt like a stitch-up where the sort of governing president and the main opposition party got together. And in this context, William Ruto was seen as the kind of radical insurgent, and he won unexpectedly. And it felt at the time as though he'd won with quite a lot of youth vote. He was somebody, William Ruto makes a lot of his story as somebody who's come from a poor background, dragged himself up. He's a kind of grifter who works his way around the streets, started with a street stall, built a great fortune. And this has started to come right off the rails in very surprising ways. So people thought that William Ruto was going to be this sort of populist, backed by young people coming in with quite radical views, instead of which what happened is he got into office and, facing the big debt that there is in Kenya, he went down the kind of technocratic austerity route and was convinced that what he was going to do was start sorting out the finances, raising taxes, and this unleashed amazing stuff. So in June, just a month ago, when we were all caught up with the British election, I guess, and not paying any attention to anything in the world, young Kenyans stormed the parliament. And you can see people with, presidential security guards with submachine guns in the street, tear gas, people being killed. And as you say, this amazing mobilization through social media. And William Ruto has gone from being somebody who the international press, at least, was presenting as the voice of kind of young insurgent Kenya to being seen as the representative kind of old austerity establishment. I
Mm.
think he fired almost everybody in his cabinet. He's had to reverse on all his tax changes. And this will also worry people because Kenya is one of the great beacons of Africa. It's the place with one of the most educated populations. It's the leader on tech. It's had one of the most steady and sustained economic growth. It's very, very dominant in sectors from agricultural exports to banking, somewhere the rest of Africa's looked at with envy. But his inability to try to balance the books, get debt under control, get the taxes up, is going to something that will really trouble investors, as well as being a reminder of the power of social media.
I said earlier that lots of people have been injured. Of course, I shouldn't make clear lots of people have been killed as well. And I think I'm right in saying that 4 police officers are facing possible criminal charges for some of the shootings. Let's stay abroad. Brian O'Carroll, what are your thoughts on China having military drills in Belarus, and what are the potential implications of this?
This is part of a much bigger story, which is really maybe the story of our whole generation, will
Yeah.
probably define the next 10 years, which is, are we getting into a Cold War with China? And how much of a threat is China? I've just come from the US. And as I say, I've spent a lot of time with senior US policymakers. And what's so striking about it is the incredible bipartisan cross party consensus that what they need to do is to confront China. And we've seen this in many different ways. We've seen this in the sanctions. So Trump is now going into an election in which he's talking about 60% tariffs on all goods from China. We've seen this in congressional investigations into TikTok, which, of course, has strong Chinese ownership and control, and which many American politicians are presenting as an attempt from the communist regime in China to undermine American elections. But we've seen it above all in the latest NATO meetings where
Mm.
there've been these very strong statements. China initially was very careful about getting too close to Russia and Belarus after the Ukraine invasions. And in fact, there were stories that very strong warnings from Biden and a red line from Biden kept them out from providing any support. But Biden didn't really follow through on those red lines. And over the last year or so, China has begun to supply more and more machinery equipment, which is quite useful for the Russian military base. And NATO's come out criticizing them. And this raises the big question, of course, which is, will America be able to sustain a coalition against China? Or is the reality that the Chinese economy is so big, its exports so large that Europe's going to be very reluctant to confront China, and much of the rest of Asia, including Singapore, isn't going to want to get itself into a cold war with China. Over to you.
What just to explain what these exercises are, it's called Eagle Assault 2024. And I guess that, it's coming on the back of the NATO summit. And 2 things going on. I'm sure you've mentioned before that American politicians now speak far more about Asia than they do about Europe. There is this sort of greater interest now in the Asia Pacific region. Japan and South Korea were big participants in the NATO summit, and America made a big show of their relationship at that. And the Chinese are calling these 11 days of what they call anti-terrorism exercises, and they're taking place in a place called Brest, and that is very, very close to Poland. And Belarus, of course, Belarus borders Ukraine, and Ukraine also borders Poland. So this is, of all the places to pick where you're going to go and do some anti-terrorism training, it's not entirely obvious why Belarus is the most obvious place. And so what it does signal is this further closening of the relationship with Russia. And you've also had fairly recently, meetings between Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, and Xi Jinping, the leader of China. So there's a pretty clear signal in this, which is NATO. You had your fun, you had your summit, you said all the things you had to say, and here we are, right on your border, training with one of your least favourite leaders on the planet.
And some relevance to this to the UK because our friend George Robertson is now chairing, along in fact with some. In fact, we might want to interview him on trip, but he's also chairing along with
Fiona Hill.
Fiona Hill, who we have interviewed on leading, um, a defense review, and he is positioning China. It seems in some of his rhetoric in a group with North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And that's something that, again, in the US context is the dominant view. I'm a bit worried about this. I'm a bit worried about this because I don't think China is like North Korea, Russia, and Iran. I think North Korea, Russia, and Iran are spoilers who have a real interest in destabilizing the global system. China, I think, still, despite the nationalist rhetoric, is a country with a real vested interest in stability because it's the world's largest exporter, it's the world's largest manufacturer. I see it as a status quo power. I think it needs to be continued to be contained and dealt with in relation to Taiwan. But I think it would be dangerous to push China into a group with Russia, North Korea,
Mm,
and Iran. And I think we've got to be careful that this rhetoric about a new Cold War doesn't end up creating conflict where there might not have been conflict with a
mm.
more cautious approach.
No, you're right. But the George Robertson review will be interesting. Fiona Hill, as you say, who we interviewed a while back, is also on it. The third member review, General Sir Richard Barrons, who was the commander of the Joint Forces Command, former deputy chief of the Defence Staff. So pretty heavyweight people. And as you say, at a time when a point that both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer were making during the general election, that the world is probably more dangerous than it's been for a very, very long time.
Those are pretty hawkish figures. And we're likely to end up with a pretty pro American defense review coming out of that that will echo America's view of quite black and white view of the world. And the risk there is that it will put us a little bit at odds with Europe. Europe, I think, is so important at the moment. We forget the European economy combined with Britain is larger than the Chinese economy still. And it's astonishing how little the US is currently talking about Europe and the UK, how important it should be to the West. And Europe, I think, has some hope because Europe, partly because of its vulnerability, because Europe is dependent on the world for trade, dependent on China for trade, dependent on America for security, dependent on Russia for energy. So Europe can't afford in the way the US does to get into these very confrontational positions because the US isn't dependent in that way.
Mm.
And one of the challenges for Keir Starmer is going to be how is he going to navigate a defense review, which will probably be quite hawkish and aggressive, with European partners who will probably want a more moderate approach towards these things.
Okay, now, Paul Abbott, have any politicians regained some respect in the UK following the election? While you're thinking about that one, I'm going to raise you Rishi Sunak.
Yes, I mean, I guess presumably this has been, the way that he's behaved since the election has really, his graciousness about Keir Starmer taking over, the contrast with the way that Donald Trump dealt with Joe Biden stepping down. I mean, many of the people I see in the US have noticed it, praised it, and I think Rishi Sunak may just have got himself back into. I asked you actually before the election whether you thought he'd become a sort of national treasure like John Major over time,
No,
and you said you
I
didn't
I
think
don't
it.
think we
But
should. Let's not overdo it, Roy. Let's not overcook this particular cake. But I do think that he, both on the night, election night, and in his demeanour since, which is getting a bit of stick from people like Braverman, lots of talk of Braverman defected to reform. And the funniest part, Rory, the bit that got the most laughter in the King's Speech debate in Parliament was when Suella Braverman stood up and attacked the government for not getting rid of the two-child benefit limit. So she's now apparently a great crusader for child poverty, which was news to everybody. No, so I think Rishi Sunak has handled himself pretty well, and as you say, the contrast with others, particularly in America. Also, I don't know if you saw the footage in the French National Assembly of the left wing MPs refusing to shake the hand of the guy they were meant to shake the hand with as they dropped in there, part of their procedure for sort of entering the parliament because he was there as part of the far right. So,
Yeah, we'll share the clip in on the show notes, but I thought that was a very interesting clip, that French Parliament clip, because it's completely polarizing. I think for the left, everyone's like, "Great, look at this fantastic clip of them refusing to shake the hands of the right-wing politician." My guess is, and I'm interested whether you agree, that if you're a right-wing viewer of that, you see this as completely disgusting and a sense of an establishment stitched up and people refusing to follow constitutional procedure and just being impolite. So it'll just make the right feel more sort of vindicated, victimized, and persecuted.
well, yeah, but maybe we should come back to France next week. I wouldn't underestimate just how polarized, how the polarization goes beyond the politicians right now. Um, so no, but I think you're right. I think people want to elect politicians who they can then leave to get on with the job. But it was quite dramatic, and the poor guy, he did hold his hand out every single time, and they snubbed him every single time, including one guy who pretended to be playing that funny game with scissors and rocks.
Yeah, and I think the guy holding his hand out, that the right wing politician holding his hand out, also is conscious that he will be seen by his supporters as trying to be civil and
Mm.
being rebuffed again and again.
I suppose the other person who's sort of had a real shift since the election is Keir Starmer, whose ratings have, as I predicted they would, have gone pretty high. He's had a rise in 20% of his approval ratings. Now that is because of the newness, the freshness, and etc. But as we keep saying, that can erode pretty quickly unless you deliver.
Helena Hill, can you provide an update on what's happening in Iran should sanctions be applied? Short one from me here. And actually, interesting to hear some of the criticism that I think you felt that we got after we covered the new president. I was so struck in the US that, along with the focus on China, so much of the Republican Democrat establishment has convinced themselves that they need to go after Iran. There was a lot of talk about how, we need to chop off the head of the Hydra, that all these proxy militia groups, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the militia groups in Syria and Iraq, the Houthi in Yemen, even Hamas, which is supported by Iran, can be dealt with by being much, much more aggressive towards Iran. And of course, this is a line that has been sold, particularly by the government in Israel, for a very long time. But again, I'm worried. I think it seems very dangerous because I don't believe that the only reason that Hamas exists is because of Iranian support, and that we need to think, yes, about continuing to contain and confront Iran, but we also need to get back on track with the Middle East peace process. There's no shortcut to security in the Middle East just by going after Iran.
So the pushback we got recently when we talked about the election of the new Iranian president,
Masoud Pezeshkian.
brilliant, brilliantly pronounced. What people were saying to us, particularly people who were in the opposition, is that we were buying in too much to the idea that this guy was going to represent some sort of change, even though we put in all the caveats about where the real power lay, that he would be sort of part of a team struggling for power within a pretty chaotic structure, but very very firmly run from the top by the Ayatollah. That actually what the turnout showed, particularly in the first ballot, and also what this guy represents, there is still far more opposition than there is support. And I think they felt that we were echoing a mistake by the West, for want of a better phrase, that we were accepting that this was a change when in fact it was just the latest tactical shift by the regime.
Well, it's heartbreaking, isn't it? And the truth is that since the revolution, there has been such passionate optimism and hope by the Iranian opposition, and year in, year out, a belief that this illegitimate, cruel, oppressive regime is going to be toppled. And they've been absolutely right for more than 40 years that the regime does not represent the majority of the Iranian people, and that there is a much more progressive, liberal Iran buried under the surface here that could come to light. But, but, I'm afraid the truth is that since 1979, the opposition have always underestimated the tenacity of the regime and probably underestimated the extent to which it still has strong support, particularly in conservative rural areas. And I think the the West needs to be a little bit careful, particularly as the rhetoric is ramping up from Israel against Iran, in believing that somehow there is an easy way of somehow toppling the regime. I mean, Iran is under profound sanctions. The US government has been trying to topple the Iranian regime almost continuously since 1979 without success. And I don't want to sound too Eeyore about this, but I think the opposition, like, all tribute to them. But this is part of a pattern of campaigning which sadly hasn't really worked out so far. Alistair, question for you. Derek Grion, what do you think will happen next in Hungary with Orban now that Ukraine has closed its oil pipeline supplying it? Are there still ways for him to wiggle out of a possible fuel crisis?
Now, I don't know the answer to that one, but I do know that one of the reasons Orban is big time in the news yet again, and let's remind people this is a relatively small country, but very significant because Orban is right out there on the populist nationalist right, very Trumpian, very close to Trump, and has, frankly, got pretty bad relations with a lot of his European Union colleagues. And now you remember from the days when we were in the European Union, Rory, and you were a minister, the rotating presidency, where one of the member states has the presidency of the European Union, currently Hungary, and they've just been stripped of the right to host the next meeting of foreign and defense ministers because of their stance over the war in Ukraine. And this has been announced by Borrell, who's the European Union sort of senior foreign policy figure, so that we have to send a signal, even if it's a symbolic signal. Orban has to call this incredibly childish. But I guess it underlines how difficult it is once you've got a member state and that member state is pushing as far as they can, as close as they can to the borders of legitimate argument and legitimate debate, legitimate differences of opinion. But I've often wondered, Guy Verhofstadt, who we spoke to on Leading a while back, the former Belgian Prime Minister, he's been going on for ages. When are we going to face up to the threat that Orban represents to European values? But this looks like, a step in that direction.
Yeah, and I think watching this question on oil is really important. We talk a lot about sanctions against Russia, but Hungary and Greece remain very dependent on importation of, and Austria to some extent, of Russian oil, and particularly gas and LNG gas. But these pipelines, sorry, do that again. We talk a lot about sanctions on Russia, but of course, Hungary is one of those countries, along with Austria and Greece, that remains very dependent on Russian gas. And the European Union is still, despite all these talk about sanctions, still funneling billions of euros every year to the Russian exchequer, which is helping to finance the war to keep our energy going. Can I maybe finish with one that interests me, and I don't really have an answer to, and it's a bit dangerous to ask a question that I don't really know the answer to. But Aaron, what do you think about the Just Stop Oil sentences? So 5 supporters of the Just Stop Oil protests received 5 4-year sentences, longest sentences ever given in the UK for non-violent protest. So what's your instinctive sense on that, politically, legally, morally?
Well, my instinctive reaction when I heard it was that is ridiculous. We talk a lot about, and there's a big debate going on about the prisons at the moment because we're having to let lots of people out early because of prison capacity. And I understand why people get really, really fed up at protests which disrupt their efforts to get their parents to hospital, their kids to school, although frankly, I think everybody should walk to school, or indeed get to work. So I understand the anger that there is, but this was people who were planning protests. And I hope that one of the things that Labour maybe signals early on is that whilst they accept that people get frustrated by protest, that the right to protest has got to be a fundamental part of our democracy. So my instinct is really against it.
Yeah, I mean, it does, without us sounding too sort of cliched liberal on this. I mean, they've literally been given these sentences, very long sentences, for plotting something over a Zoom call. What they were plotting to do, I think, is to climb over onto the M25 and stop people driving up the M25. Now, I remember obviously this comes from the context of both Conservative and Labour politicians going out, and Keir Starmer was doing this too, pretty
Yeah.
illiberal statements. We can't have these people shutting down our things; they need to be dealt with, and presumably the judge is responding to those kind of legislation. But it is worrying, and it's worrying because it will also have huge implications in other countries where climate and environmental protesters could find themselves in real trouble from authoritarian regimes locking them up. Them being able to point to Britain and saying, well, if Britain's giving people, 5-year sentences for going on a Zoom call talking
Mm.
about stopping people driving down the M25, that I think this is pretty sad. And it would be nice to see, particularly, as you say, in the context of overcrowding in prisons, but also some more liberal comments coming out of the Labour government on this.
Now, my last question from Jamie Good: how concerned should Labour be with tackling the rise of young men being radicalized by online influencers? Is this further evidence of a need for a men's minister? I'm not sure about the need for a men's minister, because I think the consequences of what Jamie's question is about are actually often it is the impact upon women and the protection of women and girls. There was a report this week from the National Police Chiefs Council which talked about this issue of extreme misogyny being a national emergency. And we're back to our old friend. Maybe we should have raised this one with Nick Clegg as well when we spoke to him. Back to our friend social media. Uh, as you know, Rory, particularly with my new books out, I go into schools a lot. It is, I can't remember the last time I went into a secondary school without the name of Andrew Tate coming up. Now, Andrew Tate would no doubt love to hear that, but
And
he
just
is.
sorry for listeners, just give us a sense of some people won't have heard of Andrew Tate. Tell us about Andrew Tate.
Well, I suspect most of our listeners will have heard of Andrew Tate. He's a British American influencer. He's somebody who describes himself as misogynist.
And he was a professional kickboxer, is that right?
Yeah, and but back to the wretched reality TV as well. He really became famous because he was on Big Brother
Right,
in 2016. He's currently awaiting trial in Romania, accused of rape, human trafficking, and forming a criminal gang
right.
for sexual exploitation of women. These are charges which he denies, etc., etc., etc. But I know because I speak to what he does is this thing we've talked about before about how to use social media effectively. He makes people laugh at stuff that is really not funny.
And he's got 9 million followers or something on Twitter on the back of this. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and a lot of these are kids in school, and if you talk to the teachers,
So it's unpleasant humor, though. Sorry, just to get to the
no,
business.
by the way, a lot of it is not humorous at all.
Right,
A lot of it is direct about
right.
women's place is there to sort of serve the men. It's a very kind of extreme form of misogyny, but a lot of young men find it funny.
Right.
And that is how he sort of gets them in. And then, they become, as this report says, extreme misogynist.
So just very quickly before I come back, and I'd love you to finish on this, but just a sort of thing that this reminds me of. I was just been in Montana, and I was
Yeah.
driving around with young men in Montana, and they were talking about just how deep the support for Trump is amongst young men. I mean, that he represents for them some vision of masculinity. The guy that was driving me said, "You get a pickup truck, you start a small business, you vote for Donald Trump." I mean, this is very much part of what being a kind of young
Yeah.
man is about. And he was saying that none of his female friends buy into this, and none of his female friends fight. And I think you've talked in the past about this too, haven't you? That the far right is getting support from young men across the world.
Absolutely. And, during the election campaign, Nigel Farage was talking about Andrew Tate has a point. Young men feel that they don't know what their role in society is anymore. Well, one, it's nonsense. The idea that, quote, young men, like some homogenous group, there have always been young men and young women who face challenges, who struggle to sort of identify what they're about, what they're for. But this is being weaponized by the right wing populists. And Tate is it's been a kind of huge money making thing. You don't get 9 million followers without becoming pretty wealthy on the back of it. But one of the people quoted in this report, Deputy Chief Constable, a woman, Maggie Blythe, she said that officers who were focusing on violence against women and girls are now working with counter-terrorism teams because a lot of the issue is about the radicalization of young men through people like Tate. So part of me hates to talk about this guy because I just think he's a nasty piece of work. But the truth is that what he's managed to do is to get into the minds of a lot of young men. And when you talk to Jess Phillips, is very big in this, which is why I'm not sure that the Minister for Men is the issue. The impact is the rise in violence against women and girls and the abuse of women and girls. So I think that's why we should be worried about it.
Alistair, thank you. And I just want to finish with a final positive, optimistic note, which is that your dog or your daughter's dog has had an absolutely lovely time behind you. We've been watching, for those of you who are lucky enough to watch this on YouTube rather than listening on audio, the dog is to be found lying on its back with all four paws in the air, absolutely sound asleep, sort of soothed by the voice of Alistair into its slumber. I've been keeping my eye on it because I thought there was a moment when I talked about Iran where there was a small shift. But generally speaking, despite all the problems in the world, from Andrew Tate to Chinese exercise in Belarus, the puppy
Eddie
continues
has
to be.
slept through.
Yeah.
She's slept through all of them. And if people want to know why I say she for Eddie, which most of us probably associate with a man, Grace, my daughter, named that lovely dog after Eddie in Ab Fab, a program I have never seen.
Well, Alistair, thank you for that glimpse, and thank you all, and speak soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.